Paris, August 1572, was a city that smelled of incense and gunpowder. The French capital, grand and crowded, seemed perpetually suspended between devotion and dread. Behind the cathedral bells, behind the chatter of merchants, and the songs of riverboatmen on the Seine, there lingered something heavier and unease that had been building for nearly half a century. To understand why France would soon descend into one of the most infamous massacres in European history, one must first understand the slow, grinding pressure that made such an explosion inevitable. France, during the mid-16th century, was not merely a kingdom divided. It was a kingdom split along a fault line that ran through every family, every noble household, and every village square. The Protestant Reformation, spreading out of Germany and Switzerland, had reached French soil like a spark falling on dry wood. French Protestants, known as Huguenots, grew rapidly in number. Many were not peasants or radicals, but members of the educated classes, merchants, and even powerful nobles. Their gatherings, their psalms, their preaching, these were perceived not only as heresy, but as a direct political threat to the authority of the crown and the unity of France. Yet, Catholic hostility alone does not explain the violence that would later erupt. The deeper truth is that the French wars of religion were never simply about theology. They were about power. Rival families exploited religious affiliation as a weapon. Soldiers flying the cross of Christ committed atrocities indistinguishable from banditry. Ministers preaching God's sovereignty were funded by nobles hungry for royal favor. Religion became the language of conflict, but ambition was its heartbeat. At the center of this rising storm stood a fragile monarchy. After the death of King Henry II, in a jousting accident in 1559, France was left with boy kings and regents not leaders strong enough to rule a fractured kingdom. The real power often rested in the hands of nobles, who gathered followers through religious identity. Two families towered above all others: the ultra-Catholic House of Guise, fierce, wealthy, and uncompromising, and the House of Bourbon, whose younger branch included the Protestant Prince Henry of Navarre. Between them stood the monarchy itself, desperately trying to hold the center as the kingdom tilted dangerously toward chaos. Over these years, civil wars erupted again and again, in total each one ending not in peace but in exhaustion. Cities were sacked, fields were burned, and neighbors became enemies overnight. Paris, a staunchly Catholic stronghold, seethed with resentment toward the Huguenots, whom they viewed as traitors to both God and crown. Meanwhile, Huguenot strongholds in the south retaliated with equal conviction. As alliances shifted and ceasefires collapsed, trust dissolved across the entire kingdom. Presiding over this increasingly ungovernable France was Catherine de' Medici, Queen Mother. Intelligent, pragmatic, and politically skilled, Catherine's overriding goal was survival both for her family and for France. She pushed for compromise when others demanded purity. She attempted to balance factions when both sides accused her of treachery. But a regent without the power to enforce peace is often blamed for maintaining it. Over time, both Catholics and Protestants concluded that she served the enemy. By the early 1570s, the kingdom had grown weary of war, but had not learned how to live without it. Every peace treaty felt temporary. Every negotiation, a trap. Violence became a rhythm, not a shock. France was not heading toward a catastrophe. France was carrying one inside its chest, and in the summer of 1572, a catastrophe would find its moment. In the fragile summer of 1572, Paris prepared for a celebration that seemed almost unreal after years of bloodshed. For the first time in living memory, the kingdom appeared to be moving toward reconciliation, however cautious or fragile. A royal wedding, the union of Marguerite de Valois, the Catholic sister of King Charles IX and Henry of Navarre. The Protestant heir of the Bourbon line was meant to bind France's wounds with silk ribbons and vows sworn before God. Diplomats praised it as genius. Foreign courts watched with astonishment. Even weary commoners dared to imagine a France not governed by fear. The wedding was Catherine de' Medici's boldest gamble. If successful, it would unite two great houses, reduce the influence of the radical Catholic Guise faction, and draw prominent Huguenots into the orbit of the crown. Henry of Navarre, still young but shrewd, represented hope for coexistence. Marguerite, celebrated for her intelligence and charisma, embodied the allure of reconciliation. On paper, it was a masterstroke and elegant solution to a brutal problem. But Paris was no neutral stage for such an experiment. The city was overwhelmingly Catholic and deeply hostile to Protestantism. Pamphlets circulated denouncing the wedding as an abomination. Priests railed from pulpits, warning that the union would invite divine wrath. Merchants whispered that the capital would soon be overrun with Huguenot soldiers. Many Parisians believed the crown had betrayed the faith by allowing such a marriage at all. As Huguenot nobles arrived in the capital for the ceremony, tension thickened. Their richly dressed entourages, their confident manner, their armed guards, these details did not escape notice. For years, their presence would have signaled war. Now they walked openly in the streets of the Catholic stronghold. It felt like a reversal of the natural order. Worse, it felt like a humiliation. Finally, on August 18, 1572, the wedding took place. Because Henry was Protestant, the marriage could not be performed inside Notre Dame Cathedral. Instead, Marguerite stood inside the church while Henry waited at the top of the steps outside, an arrangement that symbolized unity only on the surface. The image was striking, a Catholic princess accepting, a Protestant husband beneath the shadow of Christendom's great Parisian cathedral. Yet beneath the applause and the cheering, something in the air felt brittle. The days that followed brought court festivities, banquets, masks, and processions. Paris dazzled with color and noise, but behind the splendor lay distrust so strong it could scarcely be disguised. Catholic nobles glared at their Protestant counterparts. Huguenot leaders sensed hostility but believed the crown intended peace. Catherine and the royal council walked on a blade's edge, hoping that amicable appearances would gradually harden into genuine coexistence. There was one figure whose presence carried particular significance: Admiral de Coligny, the most influential Huguenot leader in France, trusted by Henry of Navarre and respected by many for his discipline, integrity, and military skill. Coligny had recently drawn the young King Charles IX into discussions about foreign policy, specifically supporting the Protestant Dutch in their rebellion against Spain. This alarmed not only the Catholic nobles, but also Catherine herself. War with Spain was the last thing France needed. Still, despite ideological divisions, the court maintained a tense politeness until the morning of August 22nd, when a single gunshot detonated the illusion of harmony. Coligny, walking through the streets after a council meeting, was ambushed by an unknown marksman. The bullet tore through his hand and ripped into his arm. Blood poured. His attendants panicked. Panic spread. Someone had tried to kill the most powerful Protestant in France just 4 days after the royal wedding designed to unite the kingdom. Paris froze because the fragile peace that had taken years to negotiate had just been shattered by a single shot. The attempt on Admiral Coligny's life on August 22, 1572, was more than an act of violence. It was a political earthquake. Within minutes, Paris transformed from a city hosting post-wedding festivities to a capital paralyzed by suspicion. The shot had struck Coligny in the hand and arm, but it struck France at its core. Everyone, Catholic and Huguenot alike, understood one thing instantly: this was not random. It was calculated, deliberate, and deadly in its implications. Coligny's attendants rushed him back to his lodging in the Rue de Bathousy. Blood soaked his clothes, and yet, despite the severity of the wound, he remained conscious and composed. Surgeons were summoned, nobles gathered, and whispers spread through the corridors. The identity of the assassin remained unknown, but the list of potential sponsors was long. The Guy's family, old rivals of Coligny, were immediately suspected. Spain, threatened by Coligny's influence over French foreign policy, also had motives. Even Catherine de Medici, fearful of losing control over her son, was whispered about. Whether or not the Queen Mother had foreknowledge, she understood instantly that the situation threatened the monarchy. Huguenot nobles, already on edge in the Catholic capital, now believed that the crown could not would not protect them. They crowded into Coligny's residence, demanding justice, demanding answers, demanding that whoever ordered the attack be found and punished. Their anger was not unfounded. The attempted assassination of one of their most prominent leaders, in broad daylight and just after the wedding meant to symbolize peace, felt like a deliberate provocation. King Charles IX, who genuinely admired Coligny, was thrown into turmoil. He visited the wounded admiral in person, swearing that the crime would be investigated thoroughly. Those closest to him noted his genuine distress, his agitation, his pacing, his insistence that he had been betrayed by someone operating behind his back. But Charles, only 22, was known for instability and emotional volatility. Behind the royal promises lurked a simple fact: the crown lacked the power to reassure anyone by nightfall. The city had become a maze of fear. Protestant nobles guarded their quarters, convinced a wider plot was unfolding. Catholic factions whispered that the Huguenots were preparing retaliation for the attack. Catherine sensed that the situation was slipping out of her hands. Her strategy of balancing factions had worked only so long as neither felt directly threatened. Now one faction had been shot literally, and the other was being blamed. Catherine convened an emergency council with her closest advisors. The discussions were heated, but one desperate conclusion emerged: unless something decisive was done, the Huguenots might seize the king, overpower Paris, and ignite another civil war, perhaps the most devastating one yet. Rumors circulated that Coligny's supporters intended to force the king to adopt the admiral's war plans against Spain. Whether true or not, fear inflated these whispers into imminent catastrophe. The Guise family, meanwhile, acted with practiced indignation. They denied any involvement in the attack, yet their men filled the streets, armed and alert, as if expecting further violence. Their presence inflamed tensions further. The royal council faced a situation for which diplomacy was no longer enough. Every noble, every ambassador, every guard captain saw the same truth: Paris was balanced on a razor's edge. One misjudgment, one rumor, one spark would trigger an inferno. The wounded admiral, recovering in bed, was not thinking of rebellion. His concern was simply to survive. But outside his room stood hundreds of Huguenot nobles' leaders. Commanders, influential men concentrated together in one small section of Paris, and it was that concentration, so many powerful Protestants in one place, that made the next step possible. It also made the coming massacre inevitable. On the night of August 23, 1572, as Paris lay under a thick veil of tension, the royal palace swarmed with frantic whispers. The attempted assassination of Coligny had placed the monarchy in an impossible position. Huguenot nobles, some of the most powerful men in France, were gathered in the capital, furious, armed, and demanding justice. Parisian Catholics watched them with hatred sharpened by years of propaganda. Any move from either side could ignite the city. Inside the Louvre, Catherine de' Medici realized the fragile equilibrium she had spent a decade trying to maintain had shattered beyond repair. She could no longer balance the factions. She could only try to prevent the kingdom from collapsing outright. And so, as torches flickered against the stone walls, she summoned an emergency council of her closest advisors, including her younger sons, the future kings Henry III and Francis, Duke of Alençon, well, as key royal ministers. The atmosphere in the chamber was suffocating. The counselors argued, paced, slammed fists on the table. Some demanded swift punishment of the Guise faction, believing them responsible for the attack. Others warned that accusing the Guises could provoke Catholic mobs into riot. And looming above every argument was the same terrifying question: what if the Huguenots retaliate? Hundreds of Protestant nobles slept only streets away. Many had brought armed escorts. If they interpreted the assassination attempt as a prelude to a larger plot, they might strike first and seize the king in the chaos. Catherine, long accustomed to political storms, faced something new that night: panic. Her power came from manipulating uncertain men, but now uncertainty had turned to terror. Every scenario ended the same way: civil war in the streets of Paris, perhaps even an uprising inside the palace itself. The council argued for hours, but no path offered safety. King Charles IX entered the meeting well past midnight. Witnesses later described him as pale, exhausted, and deeply shaken. He had spent much of the evening oscillating between anger and despair, consumed by the feeling that he had lost control of his kingdom. His loyalty to Coligny complicated everything. He wanted justice. He wanted order. But he wanted peace, most of all, in peace was now slipping beyond reach. It was during this chaotic council that Catherine and her advisors reached a fateful conclusion. The crown could no longer risk the possibility of a Huguenot coup. Whether such a coup was real or imagined mattered little. The fear of it was enough. If Coligny survived, he would continue to influence the king. If the Huguenot nobles remained together, they possessed enough power to challenge Catholic dominance in Paris. The monarchy, cornered and unstable, made a decision born of panic rather than strategy. The proposal was as shocking as it was irreversible. Eliminate the Huguenot leadership in one swift blow. Not the thousands of Protestant commoners scattered throughout the kingdom, but the concentrated group of military commanders, aristocrats, and political leaders currently sleeping in the capital. Strike now, the councillors argued, before they could strike first. Neutralize their leadership, and the Protestant threat would be broken. France, shaken but intact, could be controlled again. At first, Charles resisted. He shouted, cursed, accused his mother of manipulation. But as the arguments grew louder, as the fear in the room became palpable, as councillor after councillor insisted that the kingdom faced imminent danger, something inside the young king snapped. Exhausted, overwhelmed, and terrified of losing the throne, he relented with a single outburst that history would never forget. Then kill them all so that none remain to reproach me. Silence followed. The decision was made. The massacre was not the act of a confident monarchy. It was the act of a monarchy drowning in fear, and the city outside the palace walls had no idea that its most horrifying night was about to begin. The decision reached in the Louvre that night did not remain theory for long. Once the council dispersed, the work of turning fear into action began with ruthless efficiency. Orders were whispered down corridors carried by pages, delivered to captains who had long served the crown. The task was clear, the timing precise, the target unmistakable. Strike before dawn. Kill the Huguenot leaders. Do it fast. Do it completely. And above all, do it in a way that left no room for counterattack. The first figure marked for death was Admiral Gaspard de Coligny. He lay in his bed, still weak from his wounds, unaware that while surgeons stitched his hand, the monarchy had just signed his death warrant. The responsibility for carrying out the assassination fell to men loyal to the Catholic House of Guise, who had despised Coligny for years. Their involvement was practical. They possessed the experience and the zeal, but it was also symbolic. In eliminating Coligny, he reclaimed a narrative of honor they believed the Protestants had tarnished as preparations unfolded across the city. Professional soldiers were positioned strategically throughout the streets near Huguenot lodgings. These were not random mobs, not yet. They were disciplined companies, placed to carry out a targeted elimination. The initial plan was not genocide. It was decapitation. Remove the heads, the body of French Protestantism would collapse. Yet the crown understood something crucial. If the killings began without warning, Paris might erupt. So the timing would depend on a single signal, one that every faithful Catholic would understand. Shortly before dawn, the bell of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois, the parish church adjacent to the Louvre, would ring. It would mark the beginning of the operation. And once the bell rang, there would be no turning back. Inside the Louvre, Protestant nobles slept in guest chambers, trusting the crown's assurances of protection. Henry of Navarre, the new royal son-in-law, and the young Prince of Condé both remained within the palace walls. Their positions complicated the plan. Killing them could shatter the fragile political balance, but releasing them alive meant risking future rebellion. The crown decided to seize them, but spare their lives. In the logic of that night, this was considered mercy. Meanwhile, throughout the narrow streets of Paris, rumors moved faster than orders. Catholic residents sensed something was coming. Soldiers positioned themselves at intersections. Gates were reinforced. The air felt electric, charged with anticipation and dread. A city so accustomed to violence recognized the signs instantly. Paris was preparing for blood. As the night deepened, so did the tension. Moonlight glinted off helmets and pikes. Windows closed. Torches flickered in doorways. In silence, the operatives loyal to the Guise family approached the lodging where Coligny lay. Their leader was Henry, Duke of Guise-Neuf, of the murdered Francis. Duke of Guise-Neuf, whose death years earlier he blamed squarely on Huguenots conspirators. For him, killing Coligny was not merely politics. It was vengeance. Just before dawn broke, King Charles IX reportedly paced inside the Louvre, overcome with second thoughts. Some said he muttered that the plan had gone too far, that he wanted to stop the killings. But the machinery he had unleashed no longer waited for his command. Orders had been given. Men were already moving, and then, at last, sometime between 3 and 4 a.m., the bell of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois began to ring. Slow at first, one heavy toll. Then another echoing through the dark, twisting streets of Paris to the soldiers. It signaled the beginning of the operation. To the citizens, it was a call to arms. To the Huguenots, it was the sound of their world collapsing. History would remember this moment as the point at which targeted political killings turned into a massacre beyond anyone's control. When the bells of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois tolled through the pre-dawn darkness, they carried a meaning far broader than their intended signal. The crown had meant them to initiate a surgical strike, a controlled elimination of Protestant leaders. But the city's Catholic population, already tense, already fearful, already inflamed by years of propaganda, interpreted the bells as something altogether different. A holy call to purge Paris of heresy. What began as a political operation unraveled within minutes. The first target was Admiral Gaspard de Coligny. The Guise-led group stormed his residence, overwhelming his guards with ease. Coligny's attendants begged for mercy, insisting the admiral was wounded and defenseless, but the attackers forced their way into his chamber. Coligny, sitting upright in bed, reportedly faced his killers without fear. "If it is you," he told the Duke of Guise's men, "I am ready." They stabbed him repeatedly, then threw his body out the window to where Guise himself waited, satisfied that his family's honor had been avenged. The Duke wiped Coligny's blood from his cloak and ordered the corpse mutilated. Word of the admiral's death raced through Paris like wildfire inside the Louvre. Chaos erupted as soldiers moved to secure Protestant nobles who slept within the palace. Henry of Navarre and the young Prince of Condé were dragged before the king and given a stark choice: convert to Catholicism or die. Both agreed, at least outwardly, to save their lives. For them, survival mattered more than defiance. But hundreds of other Huguenots staying in nearby lodgings received no such opportunity. Soldiers broke down doors, roused men from their beds, and killed them before they could reach for weapons or plead their innocence. Very quickly, the operation expanded beyond its original design. Catholic residents, hearing the bells and seeing the soldiers, believed the crown had authorized a general massacre. Mobs formed almost instantly, armed with knives, axes, pikes, and whatever tools they could find. Civilians poured into the streets, hunting for anyone known or suspected to be Protestant. Houses were marked, doors were smashed, people were dragged into the open. The violence was not only sudden, it was unrestrained. Paris became a labyrinth of terror. Bodies floated down the Seine, streets turned red. Neighbors turned on neighbors with startling speed. Some mobs shouted the battle cry, "Kill them all. God will know his own," a phrase born from earlier religious wars. Others invoked saints, the Virgin Mary, or vengeance for imagined blasphemies. The killings took on a fevered, ritualistic quality, as though the purification of the city required complete annihilation. Not all Catholics joined the violence. Some hid Huguenots in cellars, or disguised them as servants. A few priests risked their lives attempting to intervene, but they were exceptions. The momentum of the massacre swept away moral hesitation. Fear became permission. Hatred became duty. By sunrise, the massacre had evolved into something no one in the Louvre had anticipated. Catherine de' Medici, witnessing the violence spiraling beyond control, ordered proclamations, attempting to limit the killings to seditious rebels. But it was far too late. Once unleashed, mob violence answers to no authority. The Seine clogged with corpses. Survivors begged for sanctuary in churches, only to be butchered at the doors. Others attempted to swim across the river, hoping to reach safer districts. But archers posted along the banks shot them as they fled. The soundscape of Paris changed, no longer dominated by the steady toll of bells, but by screams, shouts, and the ceaseless rhythm of destruction. By mid-morning on August 24th, Paris was no longer a city. It was a battlefield, and the massacre that would soon shock all of Europe was only just beginning. By the afternoon of August 24th, the massacre in Paris had reached its crescendo. But its most far-reaching consequence was not the carnage that filled the Seine, or the screams echoing between shuttered windows. It was the message carried beyond the capital's walls, first as rumor, then as certainty that the crown of France had ordered the destruction of the Huguenots. Whether that was the original intention no longer mattered. Across the kingdom, perception became reality, and reality ignited violence. The news traveled with terrifying speed. Messengers galloped from town to town. Merchants carried whispers from marketplace to marketplace. Catholic leaders in provincial cities interpreted the events in Paris as a royal command, or at least as an invitation to act decisively against their Protestant minorities. Some local governors attempted to halt the wave of killings, insisting that Paris's violence was not official policy. But others embraced the moment with fervor, either out of ideological zeal, fear of disobeying the crown, or the simple desire to settle local grudges under the guise of religious duty. The first major bloodshed outside Paris erupted in Orleans, where the Catholic population, furious and emboldened, stormed Protestant homes and slaughtered families in the streets. The killings were brutal, chaotic, and pitiless echoes of Paris's terror, but driven by local resentments. In Meaux, mobs hunted down Huguenots in alleys and riverbanks. Toulouse, which had long been a hotbed of anti-Protestant sentiment, erupted in several days of violence. Bordeaux and Lyon, major centers of commerce and Protestant influence, witnessed some of the most organized and devastating massacres of all, in city after city. The pattern repeated with horrifying regularity. Rumor of royal approval gives Catholic mobilization gives Protestant eradication, and yet the response across the kingdom was not uniform. Some governorsmen with cooler tempers or clearer judgments refused to allow violence under their jurisdiction. The governor of Normandy, for example, rejected calls for a purge and protected the local Huguenots. In other regions, the massacre was limited to selective killings of prominent Protestant leaders rather than widespread slaughter. The French kingdom fractured along lines not only of religion, but also of local leadership and discipline. Still, by the time the wave of violence subsided, the death toll outside Paris had reached several thousand. Combined with the thousands killed in the capital, the total number of victims of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre remains debated by historians. But estimates commonly range between 5,000 and 10,000 deaths across France. Some contemporaries claimed far higher numbers. Others attempted to downplay the toll. What is certain is that the massacre became one of the deadliest outbreaks of religious violence in European history. The reaction across Europe was immediate and polarized. In Rome, Pope Gregory XIII ordered a celebratory Te Deum to be sung, believing that the Kingdom of France had purged itself of heresy. A medal was minted commemorating the event. But even among Catholic rulers, the response was not uniform. Many were disturbed by the sheer scale and frenzy of the killings. Others wondered whether France had just destabilized itself beyond repair. Protestant Europe, however, erupted in horror. England, the Dutch Republic, and several German states sent envoys demanding explanations. Pamphlets describing the massacre circulated throughout Europe, painting the French crown as treacherous, barbaric, and blood-soaked. The event hardened Protestant identity across Northern Europe, deepening distrust of Catholic monarchies for generations. Inside France, the aftermath brought no relief. The killings, instead of stabilizing the kingdom, shattered what little cohesion remained. Huguenots who survived the massacres fled to fortified towns, vowing revenge. Cities that had remained neutral now questioned the crown's authority, and the monarchy trying desperately to present the massacre as a limited operation against traitors found itself cornered by a narrative it could not control. The bloodshed in Paris had created shockwaves. The bloodshed in the provinces transformed those shockwaves into an earthquake, and the Kingdom of France was now standing on broken ground. In the days immediately following the massacre, the French crown found itself trapped between two irreconcilable realities. The first was the chaos France had unleashed, a kingdom convulsing with violence. Its reputation shattered, its citizens terrified or emboldened in equal measure. The second was the need to project authority, to present the killings as intentional, controlled, and justified. A monarchy that admitted panic or loss of control risked inviting rebellion from every faction still armed, angry, and uncertain of its future. King Charles IX, exhausted, traumatized, and increasingly unstable, faced the impossible task of explaining to domestic and foreign powers why thousands of his subjects had been murdered. In the initial hours after the massacre, the crown attempted a familiar defense. The killings were a sudden reaction to a Huguenot rebellion. This was a fiction, but one the monarchy desperately needed. By labeling Coligny and his circle as traitors plotting against the king, the government hoped to transform the massacre from a scandal into a preemptive act of national preservation. But such narratives unravel under scrutiny. Foreign ambassadors, especially the English envoy, Sir Francis Walsingham, pressed the royal court with questions the crown struggled to answer. Why were so many unarmed Protestant nobles slaughtered? Why had mobs been allowed to run free? Why were killings continuing across the provinces days after the alleged plot had been suppressed? Charles, under mounting pressure, lashed out unpredictably. In front of diplomats, he alternated between justifying the massacre as a necessary measure and collapsing into emotional outbursts. Observers noted how his hands shook, how his voice cracked, how he seemed haunted by images no one else could see. The king was only 22, but the weight of the massacre aged him in ways that the court whispered about in private corridors. Catherine de Medici, by contrast, regained her composure quickly. She had survived decades of political storms. She would survive this one as well. Calm and calculating, she shaped the official narrative with a dispassionate clarity Charles lacked. The killings, she insisted, had prevented a Protestant uprising orchestrated by Coligny. The crown had acted only to preserve peace. It was a narrative intended not to convince completely, but to plant enough doubt that foreign courts hesitated before condemning France outright. Yet the effort to control the narrative created new fractures within France itself. Many Catholic hardliners felt emboldened by the massacre. Interpreting the crown's explanations as validation of their own zealotry, they demanded harsher laws against heresy, total exclusion of Protestants from public life, and the complete suppression of Huguenot worship. To them, the massacre was not a tragedy. It was a divine cleansing, a victory to be expanded upon. At the same time, moderate Catholics recoiled, horrified by the scale of the violence and the crown's inability or unwillingness to stop it. For them, the massacre did not strengthen royal authority. It exposed its fragility. If the king could be pushed into ordering such an atrocity, what else could fear and factional pressure force him to do? The Huguenots who survived faced an even darker landscape. Many now viewed negotiation as folly. The massacre had taught them that peace treaties were worthless. Royal promises fragile, and coexistence nothing more than a temporary illusion. Those who escaped Paris fled to strongholds such as La Rochelle and Montauban, preparing for the next inevitable conflict. They no longer wanted concessions. They wanted security, something only armies could provide. The crown had hoped that eliminating Protestant leaders would stabilize France. Instead, it intensified distrust on all sides. The massacre did not erase the Huguenot threat. It transformed it into a hardened, militarized resistance. And the monarchy, far from appearing decisive, now seemed weak, unpredictable, and dangerous. The kingdom had justified the massacre in the language of order. But what it had actually delivered was the beginning of another war, a war born not of rivalry, but of betrayal. In the months following the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, France found itself staggering through the wreckage of its own decisions. The bloodshed had ended, but the kingdom was not at peace. It was stunned, horrified, polarized, and profoundly unstable. The monarchy, having hoped the massacre would quell Protestant influence, now discovered the opposite. The killings had radicalized the Huguenots, alienated moderate Catholics, and permanently weakened royal authority. At the center of this unraveling stood King Charles IX, a man never suited for the throne's burdens, now broken under the weight of a massacre carried out in his name. Those who observed him at court described a ghostly figure, haunted, gaunt, and visibly deteriorating. He reportedly suffered nightmares in which drowned Huguenots rose from the Seine, their faces pale and accusing. His speech was erratic, his temper explosive. Even routine council meetings became unpredictable, veering between denial and despair. Contemporaries noticed how often Charles returned to the same words. Spoken quietly when he believed no one listened, "I did this. I am the one." Whether these were confessions or hallucinations was unclear. What is certain is that the massacre shattered something inside him. A king who had already been fragile now began to slip beyond the reach of those who advised him. Meanwhile, across the kingdom, Huguenot survivors organized with new urgency. The massacre had proven that agreements with the crown offered no security. In La Rochelle, a fortified port city, already sympathetic to Protestantism, thousands of refugees arrived, fleeing violence or preparing for the next round of conflict. The city transformed into the beating heart of Huguenot resistance, a symbol of defiance and survival. War erupted again in early 1573. The Fourth War of Religion, sparked directly by the massacre. The crown besieged La Rochelle in an attempt to crush Protestant resistance once and for all. But the defenders, hardened by loss and with nothing left to lose, resisted fiercely. What the monarchy hoped would be a swift victory dragged into months of attrition. Disease, hunger, and exhaustion claimed lives on both sides. The siege exposed the monarchy's weakening resources and the growing impossibility of ruling a kingdom divided by zeal and vengeance. As the war dragged on, France's international standing deteriorated. Protestant states England, Denmark, the Dutch Republic, and several German principalities viewed France with open hostility. The massacre convinced them that Catholic monarchies could never be trusted. England increased surveillance of French merchants. Dutch rebels used the event to rally support against Spain. And diplomats across Europe circulated engravings portraying the French crown as murderously treacherous. The moral stain of the massacre seeped into every level of international politics, even within France. The massacre reshaped identities. Among Huguenots, it became a defining trauma proof that their struggle was not simply religious, but existential. Among Catholics, reactions diverged. Some glorified the massacre as divine justice. Others, realizing the kingdom had crossed a line, questioned the righteousness of violence carried out in God's name. The event fractured the moral confidence of the French Catholic Church, creating rifts that would echo for decades. By spring of 1574, the kingdom reached a breaking point. Charles IX, coughing blood and increasingly delirious, retreated into isolation. Physicians diagnosed tuberculosis, but courtiers whispered about divine punishment. As his condition worsened, he suffered violent fits and hallucinations. On May 30th, 1574, at just 23 years old, Charles IX died. His final days, by most accounts, were filled with terror, not peace. His death marked not the end of the turmoil, but the beginning of a new chapter under his brother, Henry III, a king, inheriting a fractured kingdom, a disgraced monarchy, and a conflict no longer contained by treaties or promises. France had sought control through violence. What it produced instead was a kingdom ruled by fear, regret, and the echo of bells that could never be unrung.
The Street Bartholomew's Day massacre did not end when the killing stopped. It did not end when the Seine ran clear again. It did not end with Charles IX's final breath or with the treaties that followed. Its true legacy unfolded slowly, like a stain spreading outward from a single point, darkening politics, religion, and national identity for generations. The massacre became not merely an event in French history, but a turning point in European consciousness. In the immediate aftermath, the French monarchy attempted to reassemble its fractured legitimacy. Henry III ascended to the throne in 1574, inheriting a kingdom exhausted by violence, yet still sharply divided. He sought compromise, ceremony, and cautious reform. But the crown's moral credibility had evaporated. The massacre demonstrated that royal promises could be reversed in a single night, that negotiations could be overturned by fear, and that the monarchy itself could be manipulated by factions more powerful than the kings who ruled in name. This loss of trust would shape every political decision for decades. Each new edict of toleration was viewed with suspicion by Protestants who remembered Paris's streets. Each new crackdown fueled Catholic radicals who interpreted the massacre as divine precedent. Henry III found himself presiding not as a sovereign, but as a caretaker of a kingdom that no longer believed in its own institutions. The massacre also redefined France's wars of religion. Before 1572, the conflict had been brutal but intermittent cycles of war and uneasy peace. After the massacre, the wars became more ideological, more apocalyptic in tone, more deeply infused with the belief that coexistence was impossible. The idea of France as a single, unified Catholic realm gained momentum among extremists. Huguenots, meanwhile, embraced the conviction that survival required political autonomy or even full independence. The wars escalated into new phases. The rise of the ultra-Catholic League, foreign interventions from Spain and the papacy, and the emergence of Henry of Navarre, once the young groom of the ill-fated wedding, as a central figure in France's future. He would eventually convert, famously stating, "Paris is worth a mass," and become Henry IV, the first Bourbon king. Under him came the Edict of Nantes in 1598, granting substantial rights to Protestants and finally ending the bulk of the religious wars. But even this landmark edict carried the shadow of Street Bartholomew's. It was not generosity that inspired religious tolerance, it was exhaustion. France had learned, brutally, that forced unity produces only greater division. The peace Henry IV forged was pragmatic, not idealistic. It recognized that after decades of betrayal and bloodshed, coexistence was the only path that would keep France from tearing itself apart. Yet the massacre's legacy extended far beyond France. Across Protestant Europe, it became a rallying cry, a warning, and a political weapon. In England, it inflamed fears of Catholic plots and contributed to the hardening of national Protestant identity. In the Dutch Republic, engravings of the massacre circulated widely, used to justify rebellion against Spanish rule. In the German states, it fueled distrust of Catholic princes. The event became a symbol not just of French brutality, but of the dangers of religious fanaticism and the frailty of political power. Even centuries later, the massacre remained emblematic of what happens when fear overrides reason, when leaders surrender to panic, and when religion is weaponized in the service of political survival. The bells of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois continue to echo in the historiography of Europe, a reminder of the moment when a kingdom chose violence over diplomacy and paid for it in generations of instability. The Street Bartholomew's Day massacre is a story of power collapsing inward, of leadership failing at the exact moment it was needed most. But it is also a warning, one preserved in diaries, paintings, treaties, and the collective memory of Europe. A warning about what happens when a society convinces itself that its neighbors are enemies, that compromise is betrayal, and that coexistence is impossible. A warning that rings, even now, across the centuries.
If this story moved you, if it made you think about how fear, faith, and power can reshape entire nations, then stay with this channel. There are more forgotten nights, more turning points, more quiet catastrophes that shape the world we live in. Subscribe, leave a comment, and let me know which chapter of history we dive into next. Sometimes the past whispers warnings. Together, we learn how to listen.